Ben, delighted to have you back on our speaker panel. Thank you very much for being here. There's a lot of discussion at this conference, as there always is, but of course there's also debate that comes hand in hand. What part of the debate has really stood out for you in terms of where we are in 2015?
Well, on the debate issues, quite clearly, there are differences in armies about the relative merit of heavy tracked armoured vehicles versus medium weight, which can be tracked but are more often wheels. Now, the arguments for wheels versus tracked are well rehearsed. For medium and light armoured vehicles, wheels give reasonably good off-road mobility, but they also give the ability to move fast over operational and strategic distances, which was vividly illustrated in the presentation on the role of VBCI in the French intervention in Mali. But on the other hand, tracks can give you a very high degree of tactical mobility, as was claimed for the new UK Scout armoured vehicle, which claims it's got the same remarkably low ground pressure of the British CVRT. But the other thing tracks give you is the ability to have weight. And weight itself is a negative factor because it drives up cost and all other things, it drives down reliability and increases the requirement for maintenance. But what weight gives you is a lot of inherent passive protection. Now, clearly, active protection systems may well, in the course of time, enable medium armoured vehicles to achieve some of the protection that is achieved by heavy armoured vehicles. But my feeling is that active protection systems, of which the top of the range in service is probably the Israeli Trophy, are heavy, they're complicated, they're probably quite expensive, and they probably also carry quite a burden of command synchronization and also training. So it was very interesting that there was a brief presentation by an Israeli officer about Trophy. I think what the conference has also illustrated is that NATO armies have some very hard choices, because as Russia has intervened in Ukraine, NATO has now declared that it needs to deter Russian adventures against members of NATO by deploying forces which are there to reassure the NATO members and also to deter the Russia against mischief in NATO's frontline states. Now, if NATO is going to deploy forces to deter Russia, they actually need to be capable of combat against Russian forces. And Russia, of course, has spent a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of energy in the General Staff and the Army in reforming, modernising and upgrading their armed forces. They've still got very capable armour, albeit it's the top of the range of the Cold War generation of armour, and they've got a lot of it. They've got the equivalent of 5 armoured brigades and the equivalent of 35 motor rifle brigades, plus a hell of a lot of artillery. And what we've seen with the fighting in Ukraine is local air superiority being denied to the Ukrainian Air Force by the introduction of layered air defence. We've also seen what looks to me like extremely effective Russian artillery. And I think if there's one question that really has been begged here at the conference, it's the threat from artillery. Because modern technology has meant that artillery has become much more flexible and responsive, much more accurate than it used to be. So as the French generals are explaining about Caesar, it's possible to concentrate artillery fire of such density that it can knock out light armoured vehicles. And I don't think this factor has really sunk in with NATO armies, or for that matter, Western armoured vehicle manufacturers.
So if you were really coming down on one side of the fence, you would say perhaps that current NATO fleets are not up to the standard that they need to be at for potential combat situations of this type.
Well, this is where heavy armoured vehicles is extremely useful. And indeed, if we look at the British, if you look at their intervention forces, there's an amphibious brigade which has got some light armour, there's an air assault brigade which is mixing attack helicopters and paratroopers, and then there are 3 armoured infantry brigades which are heavy. They're tanks, they're warriors, they're going to be scouts, and they've got mechanised infantry in Mastiff, the Cougar MRAP. Now, they're all very heavy, but that heaviness gives them an inherent, high inherent level of protection compared with, say, a French brigade of wheeled armoured vehicles. Now, the US is lucky because it can afford to have quite a few infantry brigades. It's also got its 7 Striker brigade combat teams based on the Striker, and then it's got, a fair proportion of Armoured brigade combat teams. But I must admit, if I was a NATO country and had forces that I was going to assign to combat roles in Central and Eastern Europe and the Baltic states, my natural inclination would be to look for heavier forces rather than lighter ones.
So that's the position we're sort of looking at the moment. In terms of this event here, first of all, why have you returned, and also to what extent can the discussion be leveraged to perhaps provide some solutions or decisions in making the future as effective for our forces as possible?
This is the 5th International Armoured Vehicle Conference I've been to, and I'm very grateful actually that you invited me to my first one in 2011, shortly after I've left the Army. Well, I think you do get some very interesting presentations with a mixture of armies and industry, and actually not all the army presentations by armies teach me new things, but I've often learned from the presentations by industry, and often not the big bears of industry. You can learn as much from an SME that's got a unique sort of armour. You can learn from an SME that's been doing interesting work with mine ploughs, for example. There's also the opportunity to meet people and have interesting conversations and get some alternative perspective, and particularly the non-European perspectives I value. Personally, I intend to leverage some issues this afternoon by posing some provocative questions about what I think are the implications of the unexpected wars of last year, the eruption of ISIS in Syria and Iraq, and the unexpected wars in the Ukraine. And I particularly think there are hard lessons to learn about manned ground reconnaissance, which it seems to me ISIS have been pretty good at. Also about the importance of battlefield artillery and the roles of tanks, APCs and armoured infantry fighting vehicles in urban combat.